Tim Henstock, I'm one of the members here. We are coming now to a time where we're going to hear from the Bible, which is one of the key ways that we believe that God speaks to us. So the reading this morning comes from the book of Exodus. You can find it on page 58 in the blue Bibles that should be somewhere very close to where you're sitting. Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby as a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And now we're going to continue at the end of chapter 2, so on the opposite page, reading from verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Thanks, Tim, very much. My name's John Risbridger, one of the ministers here. Again, welcome, especially if it's your first time. Really great to have you at Above Bar today. We're setting out on a journey this morning through the book of Exodus. We'll be following that journey up until pretty much Christmas. So we're really excited at all that God has for us in this amazing book. Let's pray for a moment, shall we? Dear God, you are a God who speaks, and your word gives life and shapes life and changes life. Please come by your Spirit and write your word deep into our hearts and lives, we pray. We're listening to you. In Jesus' name, amen. So back in the summer, I hate saying that. It's just such a September thing to say, isn't it? But anyway, it's really cold today as well, isn't it? Back in the summer, when it was warm and the sky was blue, we had a day with my family on the Med coast in Nice, south of France. Now, undoubtedly, things are so much nicer in Nice, as the song says. But to be honest, for me, wandering around towns and shops just to look without even buying anything, and markets even more, for any more than about 5 minutes is sheer misery. I wasn't grumpy at all, of course, but, well, I was, actually. So by the middle of the afternoon, I was feeling like a caged tigger, just desperate to get out and do something. No more shops, please. I wasn't very grumpy. Anyway, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, yes, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we finally made it to the beach. And there's the beach, that's lovely Nice beach. And I was like, get straight onto the pebbles, no sand there, just pebbles. Get straight onto the pebbles, get changed as quick as you can, and into the sea. And while the family sedately swam up and down near the shore, I just dived in and I swam out, 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 out. Do you know, it felt fantastic, so good. There was no roads, there were no edges, there were no rules, no signposts, nobody around, and there were no shops. That was the great thing. There was just this vast blue ocean stretching on forever. I felt so free. It was fantastic. That taste of freedom, it's delicious, isn't it, when we get it? And every so often in life, you have one of those moments where you just for a moment feel like you're tasting freedom. Because actually, as human beings, we long to be free. We long for freedom. That freedom to do what I want to do. That freedom to be who I want to be. That freedom from other people's rules and other people's expectations. Freedom from addiction. Freedom from abusive or over-dependent relationships. Freedom from responsibility. We want freedom. But freedom's a weird thing when you stop and think about it. It's actually quite hard to find. Just go back to Nice plage for a moment. There was me swimming out, feeling so free, but you know, in reality, I wasn't really that free. The feeling would quickly have passed. I mean, for starters, I'm only a very average swimmer, so I was probably only about 200 meters out anyway. I wasn't exactly claiming the Med for myself, you know? And even if I were a really great swimmer and could just keep going for a long time, eventually I'd still run out of juice. And my so-called freedom would actually become death, wouldn't it? Real freedom is a bit like that. We think we find it, but then it isn't what we think it is. It's elusive. Freedom to do what I want to do, well, it quickly becomes its own kind of slavery because I want to do some dumb things sometimes. Or freedom from the expectations and restrictions of others. Well, that quickly becomes loneliness or just shallow relationships everywhere. Freedom from rules. Well, in the end, it creates chaos, not liberation. What is this freedom that we really want and hunger for? You know, you won't find a better place to explore that question than this book of Exodus that we're beginning today, because Exodus is a freedom story. It's the story of a people who were enslaved under oppression, but were set free from that by God's intervention in their story. But they weren't, here's the thing, they weren't just freed from something, freed from slavery. I mean, that's good, but that's not enough. They weren't just freed from something, they were freed for something as well. And what we're going to see is that they were freed to become the people that they were created to be. People who know God and live their lives as a fantastic picture of His goodness, His justice, and His beauty. That's what freedom is really about. And that's what Exodus is really about. The very first word, if you were to read it in the Hebrew, and I checked this with a Hebrew scholar over coffee earlier on, the very first word, because I don't know any Hebrew, the very first word is the word and. It's untranslated in most of our English translations, but that's how this book begins, reminding us that actually Exodus is volume 2 of a continuing story. So the first few verses are a quick recap on the story so far. Recently, my family and I were walking up in the Lake District, and we were with a couple of old friends who we hadn't seen for years, and we decided we were going to walk up some mountains called the Langdale Pikes. A few of you may know the Langdale Pikes. They're very beautiful. We've done them a few times, and my friend was quite sure that he had his own way up the Langdale Pikes. All you had to do was find a certain holly bush, and when you found that holly bush, the path would be clear. I should have known, really, shouldn't I? I mean, it doesn't sound very likely when you put it like that. But anyway, I trusted him. So off we set, and we walked along something vaguely like a path, looking for a holly bush, and we found a holly bush. In fact, we found 20 or 30 holly bushes, but we never did find a path. And so what we had to do was just scramble for about 1,000 foot up through a dry stream bed with lots of loose rocks that seemed to just kind of disappear onto your feet the moment you trod on them. It was one of those classic kind of every 2 steps forward, you took at least 1 step backwards. Well, it's even worse in Exodus chapter 1, because what we got here is 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. This is about tough times for the people of God. The first step forward is a step where, to be honest, it looks for the young Israelite nation that they're everything a young nation should be. Remember, just to recap, remember the story, Jacob and sons and his Technicolor Dreamcoat, or Joseph, all that kind of stuff, you remember? The family of Jacob caught in famine up in the land of Canaan where they lived, but rescued from that famine by their journey to Egypt, because one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, they'd sold into slavery there years before, and he'd risen up through the ranks, become prime minister, set up all these grain stores that were keeping Egypt and the surrounding areas alive. And so they came from Canaan to eat the grain, and the family survived. And according to verse 3 of Exodus 1, there were 70 people who had made that trip. Verse 5. But then let's pick up the story in verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation, all 70 of them, died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, underline that word. They multiplied, underline that one too. They multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Get those 3 words: multiplied, increased, and filled. Now, look back to the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1:28. This is what God says human life is all about. God blessed human beings and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. It's very subtle, but back here in Exodus chapter 1, can you see what's going on? The language is portraying this young nation of Israel as kind of idyllic, a kind of ideal of what human life is meant to be. Israel is doing what we're meant to do. We're filling the earth and subduing it. God is on their case. He's with them. This is how life is meant to be. They're free. They're everything that God intended them to be. That's the point. Forward step. But the rest of the chapter is 2 backward steps. The first one, verses 8 to 14, I'm calling it Many Years a Slave. Remember that film, 12 Years a Slave? Have a look at verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. And often new leaders are quite insecure. They're not sure about their grip on power, and they're particularly insecure about people around them that are already thriving. And so this new king saw the burgeoning Israelite community and saw them as a threat who might turn against Egypt. And so verse 11. He says, come, we must deal shrewdly with the Israelites, or they'll become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and save the country. But the backward step into slavery wasn't quite as backwards as it may have seemed at first. Because although the Israelites were slaves, actually they continued to multiply and spread. The same language being used again. So that eventually the Egyptian slave masters have to tighten the noose even further. Verse 14, they made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked the Israelites ruthlessly. So you got slavery, but continued to multiply and fill the earth, and so even worse, slavery. Backward step. But then there's another backward step. There was worse to come. I'm going to call this one ethnic cleansing, and it's pretty horrible. So the Hebrew midwives are given this gruesome task. When they're delivering a Hebrew child, if the child that comes out is a girl, she can live. But if the child that's born is a boy, they're meant to kill the child. Imagine a midwife being asked to do that. Kill the child before it took its first breath. Isn't that just horrible? See, a girl wouldn't pose any military threat to Egypt, but a boy would. So they had to go. Ethnic cleansing. But these courageous midwives won't play ball because they feared God more than they feared the king of Egypt. Verse 17, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to. They let the boys live. I love this moment in the story. Here we've got working women full of faith playing a pivotal role in the plan of God. And it's there in the second book of the Bible. Working women full of faith at the heart of God's purpose. That's an awful lot of smashed stereotypes in one short sentence, isn't it? Yeah? These women are the heroes of the story here. So can I say to some of you working women here, and to working men, but working women especially today, here's an encouragement for you. Fear God more than you fear your boss, although do honor your boss, you're meant to do that. But fear God more than you fear your boss. Prize God more than you prize your bonus and promotion. And God can use you there, even in a really hostile working place. God can use you. He wants to use you. And so verse 20, God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. Can you see? You can't hold them back, these Israelites. Now, intriguingly, verse 20 there is the first time in the chapter that it actually says about God doing something. It's the same in chapter 2. You go all the way through the chapter, and it's only when you get to the last couple of verses that God is doing anything. Verse 24 and 5, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites, and God was concerned about them. But go all the way through the rest of chapter 1, and all the way through the rest of chapter 2, and God isn't doing anything. Or at least that's how it felt at the time, and that's what the writer is subtly saying here. This was a tough time for Israel, a time when it felt like God, was absent, wasn't doing anything, he wasn't there. And there are times in life like that, aren't there? I've been in one of those times recently, to be honest. And so for me and for others of you, perhaps in those times, and for all of us when we hit them, these two verses at the end of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 2, they're a massive encouragement, because what they tell us is that even in those tough times, even in those times when it feels like God isn't there, or if he is, has forgotten about you, even when it feels like things are hostile and difficult, God is there and God does care. Isn't that fabulous? And isn't that important for some of us here this morning? Maybe even for some of you as students in the city, it can be pretty tough, actually, getting established as a new student in a city that you've not lived in before. It can be fantastic as well, but it can be tough. And you don't always feel God is there, but God is there. You might be the only Christian on your course or in your hall, but God is there, and God does care. He's not far away. And of course, back in Exodus chapter 1, that is why, despite all the mess, despite all the opposition, despite the horrible suffering of this chapter, the Israelites at the end of the chapter are still being fruitful. They're still multiplying. They're still filling the land. They're still being the people God intended them to be, because God hasn't abandoned them. He is there, and he does care. God isn't defeated by mess. God isn't defeated by opposition. Sometimes we are, but God isn't. As Jesus himself will put it later, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You know, I'm so glad I can hold on to that just now. Maybe maybe you're not yet a Christian. And maybe one of the reasons you're not yet a Christian is because of the issue of suffering and the things that God somehow seems to allow in his world. And that's a really tough question. We haven't got easy answers. There are lots of angles that you can take to wrestle with that. But here's just one. You're going to live in a suffering, messy world anyway, whether you believe or whether you don't. Would you rather live in that world, in the aloneness of a godless universe? Or would you rather live in that world with a God you can cling to when there's nothing else to rely on? I know which choice I'd rather make, even if it leaves me with some questions that I can't always answer. God cares in tough times. Second thing, the shape of things to come. This is about God caring in critical times. So we've seen that the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, is desperately trying to control the population of the Israelites, and he's failing. They keep on multiplying like rabbits and growing and growing. And at this point, things turn really nasty, even nastier. Chapter 1, verse 22, Pharaoh gave this order to his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let everyone live, every girl live. So it's not just the midwives now, it's all of the Egyptian population as well are now turned against the Hebrew children. And it's not just kill them if you arrive before they take their first breath, it's if they're born, they've got to go into the Nile. Isn't this horrible? This is a critical time, but God cares in critical times. And if we're going to see what he's going to do in this critical time, we've got to move from the big story of the nation down to the agony of just one family, a couple. And the woman is pregnant. And it should have been a time of great expectation and anticipation and joy because there's a baby coming. But instead it's a time of fear and anxiety because, well, if the baby's a boy, he's going to have to die. Verses 1 and 2, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. But when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. He was a fine child. Somehow that fineness pointed to something more significant. It pointed to the goodness of the original creation, in fact. The word here for fineness is the same word that we have in Genesis chapter 1 7 times to describe the goodness, the wholeness, the way God intended it to be-ness of the whole of creation. God saw what he was made and it was good, 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 it was good. And now this mum looks into the face of her baby child, and this is more than maternal instinct. God is at work, and she sees in the goodness of this child that God has a destiny for her son, that he's going to be about restoring things to the way God wants them to be. And so, as he's going to save his people, he needs first to be saved. And so she hides the child for 3 months. It's tough to hide a baby with a decent pair of lungs for very long, isn't it? And after 3 months, she can't do it anymore. So she then, in desperation, makes this basket, lines it with tar, takes it down to the River Nile, puts her baby in it, and leaves the baby there. She sets his older sister as a kind of watch to see what's going to happen. And she steps back. What does happen? Well, one of the pharaohs, the king's daughters, a princess in Egypt, going to bathe in the river. And so she comes with her entourage to bathe, and she sees the basket in the rushes there at the side of the river, and she asks one of her attendants to see what the basket is. And then she hears a crying baby, and something in her decides to take this baby into her home. And to cut a long story short, it ends up that this tiny Hebrew baby, Moses, ends up adopted into the royal family of Egypt, brought up in the palace. Have a look at the end of verse 10. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. This is the shape of things to come in this book of Exodus. Because what God does for Moses here, drawing him safely out of the water, he's going to do for the whole Israelite nation as the book unfolds. It's a little picture of what Moses' life is going to be all about. Because just as Moses was drawn out of the waters of the river Nile to safety, so there's going to come a time when he leads the whole nation of his people through the waters of the Red Sea to safety on the other side. And they're going to stand on the other side and watch while the army that has oppressed them is drowned in the same waters, led to freedom, drawn out of water to liberation. God cares in critical times. And he shows it here by stepping in to give them the rescuer they needed, Moses. But of course, great leaders don't get born in a moment, do they? They get formed and made over a period of time. And that's where we go for the remaining verses, pretty much, of chapter 2, the making of a leader, because God is going to show his care to Israel through this great leader, Moses, who he gives them. Let's think about another great leader for a moment, Steve Jobs, one of the co-founders of Apple, of course. He was born in 1955 to two unmarried college graduates from Wisconsin College. And because they were unmarried in those days, they made the decision to give their son up for adoption. I bet they regretted that one day. Anyway, he was given over to adoption to a couple of working class parents who, when he got a little bit older and he went off to college, they were really straining to pay his college fees. All the money they'd ever saved were going in to get Steve Jobs through his university education. But Steve Jobs was incredibly kind of brilliant, but restless. He didn't know where he was going in life, and frankly, he didn't feel he was getting anything out of his course. Please don't get ideas, any of you who are students. And so he decided, look, parents can't afford this anyway. I'm not getting anything from it. And so he dropped out of college. But dropping out of college rather liberated him. Please, again, don't get ideas. Because instead of being constrained by the timetable of his course, he was now able to just go along for a while to any courses that took his fancy. And unlikely enough, in my view, he ended up taking a course on calligraphy. Probably not the one I would have chosen, but anyway, he found it completely fascinating as he was learning about beautiful fonts and proportionate spacing. And he thought this was amazing and of absolutely no practical value whatever. That's what he thought. But a few years later, he was one of the co-founders of the Apple Computer Company. And the first computer he designed, the Mac computer, he built into it beautiful fonts, proportionate spacing. Became the industry standard for PCs all over the world and part of the keys, one of the keys to his success. About 10 years after founding Apple, as you may know, he was sacked from the company that he had helped to found. But in that period, he was eventually taken back, but in that period, while he was away from Apple, he went on to found several other companies, including Pixar, which became the most successful animation studios in history. In his own words, being sacked from his own company was the best thing that ever happened to me. Steve Jobs died in 2011 with a net worth of nearly $7 billion. The forming of a great leader. Great leaders are formed by the struggles, the opportunities, and the setbacks of their early lives. And that was true of Moses, who's going to be the central human character in the rest of this book of Exodus. I talked about this section in a sermon back in August, 26th of August, if you want to have a look in on the website. Focusing then on the tough choices that Moses had to make to step out of the privileges of his royal upbringing and identify with the suffering of his own people, the Israelites. So I'm not going to emphasize that this time, but instead just highlight a couple of other quick things from his early experiences. And particularly the way that God used him right away to start rescuing people. So rescue number one, he just takes a trip out of the palace. He's still in Egypt. He sees one of his own Hebrew people being beaten ruthlessly by one of the Egyptian slave drivers. And something in him says, no, that can't be right. And so he takes the law into his own hands, kills the Egyptian, and hides his body in the sand so as to liberate and rescue the Hebrew slave. Bit impulsive. Probably not the best way to do it. The text doesn't say, hey, well done, Moses, but it was the first rescue of an Israelite, just as later he was going to rescue the whole nation. But as a result of him killing the Egyptian, news gets up to the Pharaoh of what his adopted grandson has done, and the Pharaoh decides he wants to kill Moses. So Moses is now on the run, and he has to flee to a place called Midian. And here comes rescue number 2, because when he gets to Midian, he finds 7 daughters of a local priest who are being harassed by some aggressive local shepherds. And so Moses steps in and rescues one of them. You can read about it in verse 19, but we don't need the detail, except the nice end of the story, because he gets one of the 7 as his wife. Just have a look at verse 22. Moses agreed to stay with the man, the priest from Midian, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. Stand back for a moment. A choice to leave the palace and identify with his own people. The rescue of a slave. The rescue of these 7 daughters, and now an experience of alienation as a foreigner in a foreign country, just as his own people were foreigners still down in Egypt and aliens there. Moses is prepared now for the rest of his life. Prepared for the next chapter that's going to be the most significant part of the rest of his life as he rescues his people from slavery and leads them to freedom. Do you know, I think one of the best things about being a Christian is knowing that God has a great plan for your life, and that through all the twists and turns in life, he is always working to help you to fulfill that plan. But when Moses was, if we read on into the New Testament, Moses was 40 when he fled to Midian. That's what we learn in Acts 7. And according to Exodus 7, he was 80 before he returned to Egypt to lead his people. That's a very long time, isn't it, to wait to fulfill your life's mission. 80 years. And we need to learn from that. See, God isn't in a hurry, as we so often are. He doesn't just make pop-up leaders, bing! No, he works on them to shape their character and their experience, sometimes for decades, before he uses them for their life's mission. So let me say to you, especially perhaps if you sense a calling of leadership in your life, don't try to hurry up God. Don't try to run before you can walk. You'll damage yourself and other people if you do. But instead, let him shape you. Let him prepare you. Let him invest in you. Serve humbly under others and grow and learn. And in his time, he'll open the right door for you. And it will be the right door. The making of a leader. But of course, those 80 years didn't only seem like an awful long time to Moses. Just think how long they felt for Israel, his people. I don't know if you ever watched that film, 12 Years a Slave. I remember, I'm embarrassed to admit it, I took my wife to watch it on Valentine's Day. It's not exactly the natural Valentine's treat, is it? But, do you know, that's like a couple of hours portraying 12 years of slavery. Watching that film seemed like an eternity to me. I just wanted it to finish. It was so harrowing. It's so difficult. 12 years a slave? Yeah, but what about 80 years a slave? 80 years a slave. Verse 23, the final section of our passage. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And here's the wonderful thing. Their cry for help didn't just go up to God. God heard it. Verse 24, God heard their groaning. God heard their groaning. Those are important words for some of us here this morning. God heard their groaning. You want to help a hurting person? A person whose heart is full of pain? Well, if you want to do that, you need to be like God. You need to hear their pain. Listen. Don't interrupt. Don't reject them. Don't tell them to snap out of it and stop being silly. Hear them, because that's what God is like, and it's what we need to be like as well. God heard their groaning. And he remembered, verse 24, his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. Amazing words. He remembered it and he cared. He felt concerned for them, verse 25. You know, these words mean a great deal to me. I've been passing through a very difficult time in my own life where I think I've experienced pain and distress more deeply than I've ever done before. And what this passage tells me is that God has heard my groaning, all of it, my pathetic whimpering sometimes. God has heard it. And friend, if you cry out to God, he will always listen. He will hear. He will hear. He cares about your pain. He's concerned about you. But don't imagine that means he's just going to fix things quickly. Sometimes he does. But sometimes he works on a different timescale to us. Remember those 80 long years of groaning? 80 long years? But he will always hear. And he will always listen. And he does always have a plan. End of verse 24 again. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. The word covenant there is about promise. The words of promise that God had made to these founding fathers of the Israelite nation, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A promise that God was going to make that family into a great nation, a people. That God was going to give them a land to live in and to live in with him. And that God was going to bless them in relationship with him. And that that blessing would overflow from them to all the nations of the world. It was the most astonishing promise that God had made to them. It was a history-shaping promise. It was a promise of ultimate freedom for them, because to know God and to fulfill his mission for your life, that is freedom. But it was a promise that was going to bring freedom to all the nations of the world as they were blessed through the overflow of the blessing to this great family. John Piper put it like this: freedom is being so in love with Christ that you do exactly what you want to do and it accords with Christ. Otherwise, our hearts are so lined up with the purpose of God that instead of just wanting all the rubbish, we start to want what he wants. That's freedom. That's freedom. And Exodus tells the story of that journey into freedom for Israel, as we'll see over these coming weeks. But the wonderful thing is that promise made to Abraham extends way beyond Israel to the nations, to us, to me, to you. It's like a massive tidal wave that breaks on the shore of your life and mine. Because the blessing promised to them comes to the nation, and it's still the nations, and it's still coming today into the lives of men and women. Because it is through Jesus ultimately that this promise is fulfilled. Jesus, who died on the cross to free us from our past by taking the punishment for all our failures so we could be forgiven. Jesus, who rose from death to give us a new life with God and for God. Jesus, who was so totally free that he fulfilled God's best for him no matter what opposition he faced. And Jesus, who said that if we follow his teaching, we will know the truth. And that truth will set us free. Do you know him? This Jesus? Are you following him? Are you on the path to freedom? Has he set you free from the past? And are you walking into freedom in the future with him? If you're not, why not start that journey today? And if you are, come back over these coming weeks and learn more about the thrilling freedom story that God has for each of us. Alison's going to lead us in our response.